The blockade is nothing short than a crime against humanity.
To put an end to the blockade.
Condemning the U.S. blockade of Cuba.
The blockade is illegal, is inhumane.
El bloqueo no es la solución.
The embargo as blockade propaganda has been taken at face value in Latin America, Europe, and the international community, following Havana's script.
El bloqueo es el obstáculo.
The blockade is the most important obstacle to our economic development and the well-being of the Cuban people.
In 1992, the UN condemned the U.S. embargo for the first time. However, for decades, Fidel Castro did not prioritize the importance of the embargo.
In the meantime, Cuba, they're already getting a lot of investments from a lot of countries around the world.
It had access to billions of dollars and engaged in imports and trade relations with more than 90 countries, despite U.S. sanctions.
Some of the foreign companies in Mariel are already using Cuba as a regional logistic platform to take their exports to the world market with success.
Are U.S. sanctions to blame for Cuba's economic maladies? Or is the embargo a propaganda myth used by the Castro brothers to justify the failure of communist central planning? Washington's embargo on Havana began in 1960 in reaction to national security concerns and the first wave of expropriations without compensation ordered by Fidel Castro that targeted U.S. companies.
Quite modest land expropriations were proposed.
To Washington, it was alarming Fidel Castro's effort to enlist cooperation and financial backing for the master plan against the gringos, as Castro stated during a visit to Caracas on January 23, 1959. Beginning in 1959, Havana sent armed expeditions to Panama, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the Dominican Republic to overthrow their governments. On March 3, 1959, the regime expropriated assets belonging to the International Telephone and Telegraph Company and took over its affiliate, the Cuban Telephone Company. On May 17th, it expropriated over 1,000 acres of farmland and banned land ownership by foreigners. On February 6, 1960, talks began publicly between the USSR and Fidel Castro. The Soviet Union agreed to buy 5 million tons of sugar over 5 years. They also agreed to support Cuba with oil, grain, and credit. On July 6th, the Castro regime passed a nationalization law authorizing expropriation of U.S.-owned property.
Compañía Cubana de Electricidad.
Texaco, Esso, and Shell oil refineries were seized. In response, the Eisenhower State Department imposed a trade embargo on Cuba on October 19th, covering all U.S. exports to Cuba except for medicine and some foods.
1962.
On February 3, 1962, President John F. Kennedy declared in Proclamation 3447 an embargo on all trade with Cuba, covering all of Cuba's foreign trade, again with the exception of food and medicine. In the proclamation, Kennedy said, "The present government of Cuba is incompatible with the principles and objectives of the inter-American system, and, in light of the subversive offensive of Sino-Soviet communism with which the government of Cuba is publicly aligned, I urge the member states to take those steps that they may consider appropriate for their individual and collective self-defense." Fidel Castro attempted to provoke a violent outcome during the Cuban Missile Crisis, unnerving the Soviets. After Castro allowed offensive Soviet nuclear missiles to be installed in Cuba, President Kennedy imposed a full naval blockade on October 22, 1962. Kennedy and Khrushchev reached a peaceful outcome, much to Castro's anger, and President Kennedy ended the blockade on November 22, 1962. But the Castro regime continued to protest the now non-existent blockade.
I enthusiastically accept this assignment.
In 1973, Henry Kissinger became Secretary of State and explored the possibility of a détente with Cuba. He sent this message to Castro. The U.S., in principle, is prepared to improve relations with Cuba on the basis of reciprocal measures agreed in confidential discussions, and is willing to show our goodwill by making symbolic first moves. Fidel Castro responded with a box of Cuban cigars for Kissinger and a message expressing interest in relaxing tensions. Kissinger remained as Secretary of State until the end of the Ford administration, and his plan for Cuba continued.
And my beat was Cuba.
Deputy Undersecretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger met in New York in January 1975 with Ramon Sanchez Perotti, a senior official of the Cuban Communist Party, and Nestor Garcia, first Secretary of Cuba's UN mission.
Let me remind you what the embargo is all about.
They met again on July 9th with Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs William Rogers, where they discussed some of the steps approved by Secretary Kissinger to relax tensions, phase out the embargo, and normalize relations.
I have not sought this enormous responsibility, but I will not shirk it.
Eager to clinch a deal with Castro, the Ford administration offered several inducements unilaterally. First, the U.S. voted in favor of the July 29, 1975 resolution of the Organization of American States, ending the multilateral diplomatic and economic sanctions against Havana. Then, on August 19th, President Ford eased the U.S. embargo, allowing foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies to trade with Cuba, dropping foreign aid penalties on countries trading with the island, and permitting ships en route to Cuba to refuel in the U.S. However, an easing of tensions did not occur, and the Ford administration ended up with egg on its face. Instead, Castro sent thousands of Cuban troops to Africa, first to Angola, a move interpreted by Secretary of State Kissinger as a distressing turn. Kissinger expressed that Washington was most alarmed at the interference of extracontinental powers, referring to the USSR and Cuba's intervention in Africa. Cuba's involvement continued until 1991, with more than 14,000 Cuban soldiers in that African country. Kissinger was so angered by the Cuban intervention in Angola and the failure of his détente strategy that he entertained the idea of airstrikes on Cuba. Despite this failure by Nixon Ford, the Carter administration further loosened sanctions and experienced its own policy disaster on Cuba and the region. Despite Castro not reciprocating with improved behavior, the Carter administration loosened sanctions, opened an interest section in 1977 in Havana, lifted the travel ban, and authorized Cubans to send remittances to their families.
It was a question of globalizing our struggle vis-à-vis the globalized pressures and harassment of the U.S.
Havana responded by expanding its military actions in Africa, helping facilitate genocide in Ethiopia, and in Latin America, provoking civil wars. Meanwhile, a Soviet brigade was discovered in Cuba. This culminated in the 1980 Mariel boat lift, where Fidel Castro selected violent criminals and mental patients to seed the exodus of 125,000 people in order to smear the refugees and cause a bloody crime wave in the U.S.
Cuban troops, by the tens of thousands, are doing the bidding of the Soviets in the far reaches of the world, propping up dictatorships in Africa.
In 1982, the Reagan administration placed Cuba on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism.
The freedom of Cuba is a non-negotiable demand.
For we Americans owe a debt of gratitude to the Cuban people.
Then, in 1992, the Cuban Democracy Act was passed by George H.W. Bush. It was introduced by Representative Robert J. Torricelli.
The Senate today passed a bill tightening sanctions on Cuba, 74-22.
In 1996, the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity, the so-called Libertad Act, was passed. It restricted foreign companies from doing business with the U.S. if any of their subsidiaries had commercial relations with Cuba.
They say with straight faces that doing business with Castro allows them to push him to respect human rights.
The Libertad Act, aka Helms-Burton, was a response to the February 24, 1996, downing of 2 U.S. civilian planes in international airspace by Cuban MiGs that killed 4 American humanitarians searching for rafters.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The U.S. sanctions were relaxed further in 2000, during the Clinton administration, partly due to pressure from the agricultural lobby, bent on exploring the Cuban market. The Clinton administration opened cash-and-carry trade with Cuba without credits being available to Havana. With the passage of the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, over $6.9 billion ended up in the coffers of American companies doing business with the Cuban dictatorship. But what is not told is the cost of the trading switch to Cuba's longtime partners. By then, Havana had exhausted its credit lines.
But also gave us a chance to open up relations to Cuba.
When the Clinton administration offered Cuba an opportunity to buy from the U.S., Havana defaulted on all those suppliers who supported the country for 40 years and began buying from American companies, according to James Prevor, an expert of the American perishable food industry.
Cuban leader Raul Castro.
Despite U.S. sanctions, for 60 years, Cuba received billions of dollars in foreign financing, subsidies, humanitarian aid, and remittances. U.S. sanctions did not prevent Havana from receiving more than $65 billion from the USSR between 1960 and 1990, equivalent to 5 Marshall Plans. In fact, Cuba experienced a period of abundance in the 1980s thanks to Soviet subsidies. But when the subsidies ended in 1989, Cuba entered the special period.
Estamos en periodo especial, un periodo difícil, un periodo uno de los más difíciles de nuestra historia. ¿Por qué? Porque no hemos tenido que quedar solos frente al imperio, solitos.
In 1992, Fidel Castro began blaming the economic ills suffered by the island and by all Cubans on the U.S. trade embargo it calls a blockade. After the catastrophic 1990s, the Castros found a lifeline from Venezuela's anti-American leader, Hugo Chavez, in 1999. According to independent estimates, between 2000 and 2020, Venezuela provided Cuba more than $120 billion in loans and payments for medical and security personnel and services. Venezuela was not Cuba's only benefactor. Despite the embargo, Cuba signed 27 bilateral treaties with over 90 countries, including Canada, China, Spain, Holland, Germany, Belgium, and Switzerland. The U.S. became Cuba's 6th largest trading partner, with exports of over $700 million in 2008. According to the State Department, the U.S. is one of the largest suppliers of food, medicine, and humanitarian aid to the island. In fact, some 90 U.S. multinationals have exported their products to Cuba since 2001, and many keep offices in Havana, despite U.S. sanctions. In addition to income from trade and loans, Cuba received over $22 billion in remittances, mostly from the U.S., between 2000 and 2023, according to the Inter-American Dialogue.
The Paris Club of Creditors in Cuba reached an agreement according to which the country's debt of $4 billion is written off.
To top it off, Cuba has benefited from forgiveness of its debt to international lenders, a savings of $50 billion in recent years. Between 2011 and 2015, 5 major debtors, Mexico, Japan, China, Russia, and the Paris Club, erased $48.5 billion in debt, equivalent to 50% of the island's GDP, according to Reuters and Forbes.
The Chinese government made official its donation of 700 million yuan, around $100 million to Cuba.
If you add the donations, debt forgiveness, and international financial support between 2005 and 2021, the figure is $200 billion, according to the Mises Institute. What has the Cuban dictatorship done with all the money received despite the embargo?
Los compañeros de allá, Partido Comunista de Cuba.
The apparent communist ineffectiveness to multiply wealth in order to benefit the population has to do with the strict control the regime exercises over all income it receives. The communist policy of prohibiting private initiative and systematically destroying the productive apparatus has contributed to the island's constant economic crises. In practice, the Cuban dictatorship controls all income to the island through a series of front companies managed by the military and the Castro family. Despite the sanctions, for decades the Castro regime circumvented international restrictions by using companies registered in numerous countries and tax havens to grease the machinery of repression that keeps the regime in power. In fact, the embargo did not prevent Castro from registering more than 270 companies in his name outside Cuba, amassing a fortune estimated at $900 million, according to former Cuban diplomat Manuel de Beunza, who created most of these firms.
We created a network of foreign companies for Fidel Castro, of 270 companies, from Japan to Argentina.
To control the flow of money entering the Cuban economy, the regime created the conglomerate GAESA, which emerged from the Cuban military in the 1990s to discipline the economy in the midst of the special period. GAESA currently controls 95% of the regime's finances and 90% of the dollar retail market, despite being sanctioned by the Treasury Department in 2020. Lifting the embargo may help the Cuban government obtain financing abroad, but would have a minimal impact on the lives of ordinary Cubans. It would cost U.S. taxpayers billions of dollars, as it has their counterparts elsewhere in the world. It is likely that Havana will use these additional resources to sponsor terrorism, export its model beyond Venezuela and Nicaragua, and subvert U.S. interests in the region.